Hey, it's Mike Brennan, and we're back. Sans Matt Roush, who today is doing some LTU work. That old day job always seems to get in the way. So we have got a really good show today. We've got Richard Stiennon. Richard and I go way back, and we even wrote a book together 10 years ago now. Richard, hard to believe, right?
Huh.
Yeah, I looked at that the other day. Anyway, so what I asked Richard to talk about is what should President Biden's response be towards all this Russian activity in the ransomware space and hacking and you name it. It appears some element of Russian whatever is doing it. Now, whether it's sanctioned by Vlad the Impaler or not, we're not sure. But certainly I don't think anything happens in Russia that he doesn't sign off on. Would you agree, Richard?
Totally agree, especially when there's a lot of money involved.
And yeah, the Russian economy is not that strong. It's really a gas and oil economy. They don't have a lot of other things going for them, except now ransomware, which,
Right.
we're talking about $100 million now in ransomware from these Russian folks. Let's talk a little bit about that. So I hard to believe that anybody wouldn't know about this, but let's pretend that they haven't heard and kind of set this up, Richard.
Yeah. So, from the industry cybersecurity perspective, it's just another flavor of what we've dealt with for over 20 years, right? Malware that's infecting computers and causing harm. The Russians are fairly responsible for inventing cybercrime. There used to be a group called the Russian Business Network that is reputed to be former KGB, Soviet Union people, had all these skills and they got into the crime side of things. They kind of went underground by 2008 but they invented the idea of cybercrime as a service. They would license their tools to other actors and they would use them to infect your computer and do click hijacking. Just to, I don't know what people used to use clicks for, but they used to make money by sending clicks to websites. So they would just send a lot of them and make millions of dollars. But that evolved into the malware that we saw that did, banking Trojans that would steal your credentials from your phone or your computer, and stuffing attacks and all the things that we know of as cybercrime. But they got a real shot in the arm when all of a sudden they could extort money from people using originally just Bitcoin, but now hundreds of different cryptocurrencies. And that started in January of 2009. So cryptocurrencies, something I know you track closely, are the fuel of the fire here, right? It's like so easy to get somebody to pay you. And they give it nice instructions on how to set up an account and get some Bitcoin or whatever and send it on. The most recent attack, Saya, involved Monera, which is built specifically to be untraceable, so even more anonymous than Bitcoin. And they were using that to demand all their ransoms. So that's where we are today, right? Instead of attacking individuals, which is still going on all the time. I was just on Al Jazeera yesterday morning, and sure enough, I got people connecting to me on Twitter and LinkedIn asking for help with getting their computers undecrypted. And you can just Google the malware you've got and find the instructions. There are some that are recoverable from. But for the bigger companies, they're shutting down the entire company because if we don't have our computers, we can't do email and we can't access our apps, and businesses shut down. We saw that with Colonial Pipeline. It was just a pure, hey, they're vulnerable, and spread our malware just like a worm and shut them down and then demand a big ransom from the company to get back into business. And those companies are spending millions of dollars to get their data back and not have it exposed on the internet.
Well, this latest wave, according to what I've read, is in the tune of $70 million.
Yep.
And you're not talking chump change there. That's a lot of dough.
That's a lot of dough.
And as we, I have to, my disclaimer is I don't trust the Russians. I'll say that right out front. And I know this is all sanctioned by Putin. And even though he's doing had nothing to do with it, I don't know what you're talking about. I'm not buying it. And hopefully President Biden isn't buying it either. So one of the things I wanted you to talk about is what can he do? I mean, we have to be careful we don't get into a tit-for-tat cyber war, which is essentially World War III, because both countries have the capability to essentially shut down the other country. But so how do we handle this?
Yeah. I've been thinking about it in terms ever since you asked me to be on the show. It gave me a focus to, okay, what should he do? And then, of course, over the weekend, Biden has been saying he's going to do something, possibly any day now. We'll see the results of it. I started looking at the options and I realized that, hey, let's look at history, because this is a geopolitical problem right now. It's costing the U.S. a lot of money. It's causing damage to critical infrastructure now with Colonial Pipeline, and it could happen to anybody at any time, just about. So very dangerous, and the same in a separation of the perpetrators from the state sponsored, right? So it's not the Russian GRU or SRV engaging in these particular attacks. So they have their own family of attacks that they do. And I started to think of the Barbary pirates. So from about the year 700 all the way up to the northern coast of Africa, Algeria, Tripoli, Morocco, and they were what they call the Barbary states, and they were subject to the Ottoman Empire. So the Ottoman, resided in Turkey, and they would engage in constant piracy, right? So they'd send their galleys out and they'd intercept all of the merchants, the fleets that went across the Mediterranean. They would grab the boats, grab the merchandise, and enslave everybody on the boat. And over, 400 or 500 years, some historians say they enslaved over 1 million people. Just lives of misery. So horrible, horrible thing. So the big countries, France and Austria and maybe Italy, would deploy their frigates and shoot them out of the water. Okay, so that's effective, but it doesn't stop the economy of slave trade and piracy that was going on. It was a huge, huge business fueling probably the rest of the Ottoman Empire. So that's to me equivalent of the U.S. government targeting the actual groups. So DarkSide or REvil are two of the group names that come up a lot in the news. So, and the U.S. government could damage their computers. They could name and shame them and indict them and put out the red alerts that Interpol has on those people and restrict their travel. So lots of things they could do, but it wouldn't even touch the ransomware problem that we have. You have to go higher up the chain than that to effect some change. At one point, people are suggesting that the government should have a fund to pay the ransoms for companies so they can quickly recover. And there's even an example in 1715, in Denmark, all the churches were collecting money for a slave fund, and it was to ransom their citizens that were enslaved by the Barbary pirates. And the government came in and said, oh, that's a pretty good idea. We're going to tax all seafarers and make them pay into a fund that we'll use to bail you out if you get attacked, because they didn't want them to be afraid of going to the Mediterranean. Still a lot of risk of being captured and enslaved. Even if you eventually get ransomed, it's not going to be a pleasant 6 months for communications at that time. So obviously that didn't work. Slave trade was just there, and it still fueled the motivation for capturing people because you knew there were funds there. And that's why even now cyber insurance companies won't allow you to advertise that you have cyber insurance, because then you're a target for ransomware, and then they have to pay the ransomware fees and all the rest of the damages. So Thomas Jefferson, you remember, recognized the Barbary pirates as a huge problem. U.S. citizens were getting kidnapped and enslaved, and ransoms were being paid. So that was the creation of the U.S. Navy. Remember the shores of Tripoli?
Yeah, I was going to say that's part of the Marine Corps hymn, right? So.
That's right. So he deployed our first fleet to the Barbary Coast. He didn't like win a battle and shut them all down. He negotiated a peaceful settlement right away, which basically involved the United States paying tribute to the Barbary states. As much as 20% of the U.S. Treasury went to paying off these pirates. Huh. Obviously, that didn't help either, because now they had more money to invest and do the rest of their things. But it occurred to me, if we gave 20% of the U.S. federal government budget to Putin, I am sure he would shut down all cybercrime, because that would be, hundreds of billions of dollars today. So we're not going to do that, but it does point to the fact that, hey, Putin is strong arming the United States and most other Western countries, and would be more than happy to take a payoff. But the other side of, and the payoff could be as horrendous as, hey, you can have Kiev if only you stop engaging in cyber attacks against us. Worst things that happen in international relations. I doubt that would happen. Or you can have a threat, right? You can go after his money and threaten to confiscate all of his money and all of the banks outside of Russia, right? He must have tens of billions of dollars secreted away everywhere. And you can sanction him. But I think Putin should be the one looking at history and realizing what stopped Barbary pirates. And that was when France invaded Algeria and took them over. And that led to the colonizing of most of Africa. As all the European countries said, hey, we want a piece of Africa too. And eventually the Ottoman Empire kind of fell apart. It took, another 100 years for it to actually disappear. So does Putin realize that he's setting himself up for the final option, right? His country is going to go away just because of the way he's behaving. And as you just start listing the grabbing territory in neighboring states, assassinating people by nerve agents, poisons, and other means, obviously.
Jailing political opposition
and treating them horribly. Outlawing NGOs and then labeling every news organization as an NGO and then outlawing them. Just, shooting down commercial aircraft and not admitting to it or paying reparations for it. It just goes on and on and on. And so even if you could get some concession and he taps the ransomware people on the shoulder and says, stop doing that, the rest of this behavior won't stop. So we have what I'm arguing is we have a much bigger problem than ransomware. Ransomware is a visible symptom of the problem, which is a rogue state, Russia, that's visible to the electorate in the United States, right? They don't care much about Kiev and Crimea and all those places. They don't care much about an opposition leader in Russia being poisoned. They don't pay much attention to anything, but they do pay attention to the ransomware attacks. Uh-huh. So I don't think ransomware is what President Biden should lead with, right? It should be part of an overall, put your cards on the table. We want you to stop this behavior. These are our tools for stopping you, right? We got sanctions, we got military options, short of, nuclear war, I hope. All of them, of course, come with their risks. And that's why I'm used to presidents taking the lower risk approach, and cyber attacks are extremely low risk, right? You're going to have plausible deniability. You can say, oh, that wasn't us, that was our partner, or do what Putin does. Oh, that was just some vigilantes inside the United States who did that extremely sophisticated attack.
Well, I just my own opinion, the two things that he favors the most is all of his oligarchs who do have their money spread out all over the place and travel extensively. And of course, his economy is pretty much based on oil and gas. I mean, if we shut down their oil and gas infrastructure, just like they did with, well, not but I mean, just like the ransomware folks did Well, even then, it was not really the ransomware folks that shut down the oil pipeline. It was because they couldn't do the accounting, and the company did it.
Right.
But the pipeline was still fine. I mean, something along those lines. Oligarchs, pipelines, are those two options for Biden?
Well, Biden's already issued a thinly veiled threat in a press conference where he said, he told Putin, how would you feel if pipelines? And, which is, you have to parse every word that comes out of a president when he's talking about an adversary. And I think that was a threat against the pipelines. And I always, whenever we talk about Russian pipelines, I think back to the late 70s. Reagan was president, and there was a famous, explosion of an oil pipeline. Mind you, I've never seen any corroboration of this, but the CIA has the entire story posted on their website by a guy named Gus Weiss, who was in the National Security Council at the time. And they claim that they infected the pipeline with malware and caused the pumps to, over pump and exploded the pipeline. They could see it from space, they claim. So at least, we know the history of the story, even if it's actually made up by the CIA. But, we all know that infrastructure is extremely susceptible to these types of attacks. It could be destructive attacks that go well beyond shutting down the office systems. Because that's the trouble in Russia. Office systems have only been computerized for a very, very short time. Most only have a few computers. So they have paper systems they can fall back on and recover from. So not like here in the US where, we could not do any of our work without computers. Right? Yeah. We just totally rely on them.
Well, of course, we have the Stuxnet example, which, as we both know, was the U.S. and the Israelis did that, and we shut down the centrifuges through malware and put the Iranian nuclear program back a few years. And that was like the first example of how that could be done on infrastructure. So certainly that example is out there, right?
Yep, totally. One of my concerns is thinking about how you would do any type of attack, right? You can't use one of the NSA's super cool tools that they've developed and probably invested millions in and have, special zero-day vulnerabilities that nobody knows about. As soon as you use an advanced cyber weapon, if we want to call it that, then the victim has copies of it, and they can dissect it and reverse engineer it and turn around and use it against you. So you don't want to arm them by attacking them. So, and maybe one of the reasons it's taking so long is that they have to repurpose existing attack tools used by Russia and then use them against Russia. And so that they don't get anything new, they just go, oh man, we fell susceptible to one of our own attack methodologies. And that takes a lot of work to make sure that, because the NSA uses all new stuff all the time. It's like whenever you look at Stuxnet code or anything, it's like never anything borrowed off of the internet like everybody else uses, especially cyber criminals. It's always brand new stuff. Some of it's written in C++, and nobody uses those tools in the hacker world. So it would be really evident who it was just by looking at how this code was created. And it would give away, some really cool stuff that would just turn around into massive, not Petya-like cyber attacks across the world.
So, which gets us back to what are the real viable options for President Biden to address this issue? He's got to do something, or is this going to continue on, right?
Yeah, I think certainly he's already taken the first step, which is diplomatic, right? Where you have meetings and get people together to talk about how to address. And he's had those meetings directly with Putin. Unfortunately, we did all this. All the countries in Europe got together in 2001, and they came up with a convention on cybercrime that was, finally ratified and published in 2004 in Budapest. So it's called the Budapest Convention. There's 65 signatories, and it requires you to open your channels of communication with law enforcement in other countries, so that when they say, hey, we think this guy ordering pizza down the street, you should pick him up because he's engaging in these attacks. I'm using a story from Russia and a DDoS extortionist that's how they got him originally. And so Russia, China, Brazil have never signed on to the Budapest Convention. And that would, to me, be a starting point. So look, we don't have to refigure out how countries can work together. We already know how that works, and just sign this thing. Russia has always objected because it was a sovereignty issue, right? No other country should have a right to do anything in their country. But of course, that's all the time. Those sovereignty issues are set aside when there's a bigger issue at hand. It could be a mass murder or money laundering that's going on, and countries work together and don't worry about that as much. So I think diplomatic first. Cyber tech is in there, right? It's kind of show off what we can do, scare them. But I think as part of that, it should be more of a name and shame practice, because Putin is extremely vulnerable to the kinds of things that his attackers did during the 2016 elections, right? So all you have to do is publish a bunch of stuff about him and his family's wealth. His daughter, I believe it is, lives somewhere in Europe, and there's hundreds of millions of dollars in her bank accounts. So just publish them. Publish all the money. Let everybody know that, hey, your president that wins your elections every year by hook or by crook, mostly crook, is worth, $120 billion. And here are photographs, just like Navalny had that little documentary on Putin's mansion, right? Which is
the Dhaka on the Black Sea, right?
Yeah.
$1 billion facility.
Yeah.
The czars have returned, huh? So
publish real-time camera views from inside the Dhaka, showing the shenanigans going on, or the big parties that are going on, or just things to make him look not like a leader that you should have. So, now mind you, U.S. politicians are just as afraid that their shenanigans will become public, right? We had a president who spent some time in an earlier life in Russia and maybe engaging with prostitutes and all that. And Russia probably has a lot of information on that. Would have been nice if we had that earlier. So that's, I think maybe a stronger statement than showing off our cyber chops would be show off our cyber chops based on the amount of information that we have on the oligarchs and him in particular.
Well, that's what I was thinking, is instead of directly going at him, he gets all of his power from the oligarchs. Just think if we froze all their assets. Gosh, they might say something to Vlad, do you think?
Yeah, that would upset them. Yeah, that's a great idea.
So I know you're on Al Jazeera talking about this. Is that essentially what you said there as well?
On Al Jazeera?
Yeah.
No, we didn't get that deep into it. Certainly, I thought of the pirate analogy while I was on Al Jazeera, and I said, but I didn't get a chance to say it. But yeah, pretty much I've been saying, diplomatic first, cyber second, and military third. We don't necessarily want to get involved in a shooting war with Russia. They have a couple of nuclear weapons, I understand. But, we've got, that's a big wall to climb to start launching nuclear weapons because somebody is, sinking your ships or something. Or, a cyber attack against your military infrastructure. Maybe that's the right way to do it. Stop all those tanks on the border with Ukraine. Freeze or seize our engines through industrial control attacks. All that would be, an escalation for sure. If we felt our own weapon systems were impervious to that kind of attack, that might be a good option. But I don't think they are.
Yeah, you wrote the book, There Will Be Cyber War, exposing the fact that all of our weapon systems are very vulnerable, right?
Exactly.
So, I mean, that it's a really dicey situation, but doing nothing is not a solution or a way to approach this, right?
I agree.
You got the former head of the KGB who only understands raw power. So if you don't, within reason, give him an example of your raw power, then you're not going to catch his attention, right?
Yeah, and he's, super intelligent and conniving, and he seems to know something about being a mob boss.
That's essentially it, yeah.
It's essentially it. And he knows a lot about extortion and blackmail, and threats and fear of threats. There are plenty of people that would avoid, getting the focus of his attention, right? Because they might end up dead, thrown off a balcony, so often happens, or having a 3-day drunk and falling down and hitting his head on a table has happened.
Yes, or get poked with an umbrella and suddenly get some sort of biological disease kind of thing, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I know too many spy novels that I've read and watched. So we got a few minutes left. Let's talk about any updates on SolarWinds. That's turned into something much bigger than what everybody originally thought, right?
Yeah, I think SolarWinds has been a great inducement to start looking at supply chain security in the software industry. And we all jumped to hasty conclusions when we saw that Casera, who has a SolarWinds kind of product, was a similar attack, but it wasn't at all. It was just vulnerable software, which is another supply chain issue. We all trust our software vendors to give us good software. And if they're totally full of 0-day vulnerabilities and the attacker knows about them, you're in real trouble. The presidential executive order that came out was quite motivated by SolarWinds. So we had SolarWinds. The president actually convened a group to investigate SolarWinds. And then in the executive order released May 12th, they created a National Cyber Safety Review Board. And that review board is made up out of the people who are investigating. The first one is going to be made up out of people investigating SolarWinds. So we're actually going to get to have a real practical demonstration of what the Cyber Safety Review Board can actually accomplish.
All right, and we still got about 2 minutes left. So why don't you give some information on how folks can reach out to you, and then follow up with that.
So,
I know you've written a gazillion books. I know you've got your security yearbook out there. Yep. But how do they reach out to you, Richard, and how can they get a hold of your books?
Best way is reach out over LinkedIn. I know that people who watch Al Jazeera are just Googling me and finding me on LinkedIn. So that's one good way, or follow me on Twitter. And the books are all sold, my latest book is my history of the industry, not of cyber attacks. So that's obviously the driver. And that's available at it-harvest.com/shop. And you can find it. You can find the last year's version as well.
Yeah, so that security yearbook, if one would purchase that would show all the various vendors, what they do, that sort of thing, right?
Yep, it's got a directory of 2,600 some vendors.
Wow.
And categorized by what they do and where they are too. So I've got them by country and in the U.S. by state. So you can see, and there's cool stuff to derive from that, right? California, we knew was the center of cybersecurity. But the Washington, D.C. area is growing, almost as fast, if not faster, than California. So someday that'll be the center, the epicenter of cybersecurity in the United States.
Yeah, you've got all those various groups there, shall we say, that have these 3-letter acronyms or whatever, and there's a whole slug of them in Washington.
And a bunch retire from military service every single year, and they look for jobs, and they were trained in cyber, and they speak about cyber, and they have PhDs in cyber, so they just, stay there and get a good job.
Can't beat that, huh? All right. Well, Richard Stiennon, thanks for being on the show today. Richard and I wrote a cybercrime thriller 10 years ago now. In fact, I'm looking at it sitting on my bookshelf here. It's amazing it's been that long. We should probably do the sequel since it's been 10 years. So many things we could talk about, right?
Yeah, I've learned how to write since then.
Yes, me too. All right, well, thanks for joining us, Richard.
right.
We'll get you back on the show here later. There's never enough time to talk about all the cybersecurity issues out there in the world, and that's a big one, right? So,
Beautiful. Thanks, Mike.
all right, thanks very much.